In February 1554, a Portuguese merchant ship set sail from India on its maiden return voyage to Lisbon. Prioritizing cargo over maneuverability, the ship was laden with luxury goods like silk and porcelain, making it ill-prepared for the harsh weather conditions off the South African coast. This would have disastrous consequences, resulting in the loss of nearly all 400 souls on board. Even more tragic was the brutal suffering the survivors faced on their journey to salvation. This is the shipwreck of the São Bento and the crew's horrifying ordeal along the African coast. The east coast of South Africa features some 250 kilometers of unspoiled sandy beaches, estuaries, and deep ravines carved out by powerful rivers running into the ocean. Despite its idyllic appearance and untouched natural beauty, it is notorious for its rugged and dangerous coastline, with violent storms and strong currents making navigation quite difficult in the region. Ships hug the coastline to avoid the swift Agulhas current that runs along the east coast of South Africa, leaving vessels perilously close to where even minor errors can lead to disastrous consequences. The area has since been aptly called the Wild Coast, and is infamous for the numerous shipwrecks peppered along its shoreline since the early days of naval exploration. On the night of the 22nd of April, 1554, the crew of the São Bento found themselves in the midst of a severe storm off the Wild Coast. The ship sustained significant damage, making it nearly impossible to maneuver. At the mercy of the prevailing winds and drifting dangerously close to the rocks, the captain, Fernão de Alvares Cabral, ordered his crew to aim for the closest sandy shore in an effort to ground the ship safely. Unfortunately, the ship never reached the shore. Instead, it slammed into a small rocky island near the mouth of the Mskaba River. When the ship struck the island, it was torn in half. People clung to whatever they could: boards, barrels, anything that might keep them afloat. Many people attempted to swim with makeshift floats, but as soon as the ship was submerged, those who were confident in swimming jumped into the sea. Those who couldn't swim stayed on board, but seeing that the mast was being pushed under by the force of the waves, they cut it down towards the beach, creating a bridge. Those brave enough to attempt crossing it were soon thrown off by a barrage of powerful waves, drowning those tangled in the sails and leaving only one survivor, Manuel de Castro. In a terrible twist of misfortune, de Castro found himself once again on the very coastline he had been wrecked on no more than 2 years previously. A survivor of the wreck of the São João, he was one of a handful of people to find rescue and would have been intimately aware of the perils and hardships that awaited the now stranded São Bento. However, this time he would not be so lucky. Although he survived the initial wreckage, his legs were badly crushed under the weight of the mast, and he later succumbed to his injuries. He was not the only one to meet an unfortunate fate. The sea, now littered with debris, became increasingly hazardous for those in the water. Many were caught in a torrent of splinters and nails, whilst others were knocked unconscious by large crates or thrown against the rocks by the unforgiving tide. Soon, the waters appeared stained as red as blood itself. Upon seeing the fate of those who dared to venture across the mast or into the sea, most survivors clung to the remaining sections of ship, and eventually, a large swell swept them onto the safety of the shore. When morning arrived, the survivors were greeted by a harsh reality in which they found themselves. Strewn across the beach were the bodies of those less fortunate. In total, 44 Portuguese and over 100 slaves had perished during the wreck. Remaining on the shore, faced with the grim reality of what lay ahead of them, were 99 Portuguese and 224 slaves. The survivors set about constructing shelters from what could be salvaged. As the ship was stocked full of lavish goods which could no longer be sold, their shelters stood in stark contrast from what one might come to expect after a shipwreck, furnished with lavish carpets, gold cloth, and silk scavenged from the shore. These makeshift lodgings must have been quite the sight to behold. Captain Cabral sent 12 of his healthiest men, led by Portuguese navigator Manuel de Mesquita Perestreo, to search for fresh water or a way to cross the nearby river. They found neither. It didn't take long for the local population to discover their alien visitors. In the morning, several of the locals were seen collecting pieces of the ship on the other side of the river, extracting the precious iron nails from the wood. A few of the locals bravely crossed the river, and the captain made as great a welcome as he could, presenting them with gifts of cloth and iron, hoping to gain useful information. News of their foreign arrivals spread quickly, and by the same afternoon, over 100 men were spotted on a nearby hill, carrying wooden and iron spears. The sight of this struck fear into the castaways, as men scrambled to bear arms in preparation for battle. Mercifully, their intentions were not hostile. In a shocking twist of fortune, the presence of what must have been a local chief, adorned with red cornelian beads, an item commonly traded with the Portuguese, raised the hopes of many that a rescue ship could land somewhere close in the region. However, as the day drew to a close, and without an interpreter to communicate anything of use, the locals left once more. By the 5th day, it became clear that the survivors could no longer stay on the beach. The rain was showing no signs of stopping since it was winter in the region. Furthermore, they had only managed to scavenge a barrel of biscuits, some rice, and a few pieces of meat, all of which were completely soaked through. The captain gathered his men to discuss the possible options for their rescue. After much debate, it was decided that the group would follow in the footsteps of the survivors of the São João, wrecked 2 years previously, and trekked the Lourenço Marques River. They knew that Lourenço Marques, the man after whom the river was named, was due to arrive for ivory trade in the coming months. This meant that the survivors would have to undertake a journey of almost 1,000 kilometers to the coast of modern-day Mozambique. And so, on the 27th of April, the group headed north, armed only with a few swords and shields, and one gun between them. The outlook was grim. About a quarter of the group was carrying themselves on crutches, many of them knowing they would not reach their destination. The first attempt at a route would take them inland and away from the coast. Their hope was to find a source of fresh water and villages where they could barter their iron for food. But after a few days of walking and finding no fresh water or food, the group decided to turn back to the coastline. The journey inland was also considerably more treacherous, with numerous valleys and mountains hindering their progress. Most concerning to the survival of the group were the vast rivers they encountered, with quick currents and rapids that proved extremely difficult to cross. Upon crossing the Mtento River, the group stumbled into their first village of the journey, securing some provisions by trade, but more importantly, a guide, who offered to lead them to the next village some days' travel away. This was the first of many stops where members of the group chose to remain, rather than risk the dangerous journey any longer. Following the advice of their new guide, the group remained on the coastline instead of the interior. The coastal path would give them more shellfish to eat and provide them a way of getting around some of the rivers. Their new route eased up travel, and soon enough they were faced with their greatest challenge yet, the Mtamvuna. Besides the dangerous current which faced them, there was a near impenetrable thicket which lined the steep cliff face along the river's edge. After much difficulty during the dangerous descent to the river, they began constructing bridges between the visible rocks, eventually creating a path for them to make it across. After 13 days, they had reached the location where the São João had wrecked. The survivors of the São João had left behind letters and signs that they were there, but not much remained. The group scavenged what they could, but apart from a few fragments of porcelain, the village was entirely deserted and desolate. The next few days of travel were met with a lot more resistance and ambushes from the natives, who preyed on those lagging behind while crossing the rivers, stripping some of iron and other valuables before a counterattack could be organized. The journey was not all met with hostilities, as by the 22nd day, the news of their arrival had spread so wide that they were met at the banks of the next river by 2 or 3 entire villages. The survivors were met with joyful singing and clapping, bringing cakes and food to be sold and welcome their new arrivals. Among this large group was a Bengalese slave who had survived the wrecking of the São João. Although they begged and promised him handsome rewards to act as their guide, the young man showed no interest in joining and returned to his newfound home amongst the locals. Joining him were 2 Portuguese sailors and about 30 slaves who no longer wished to endure the labor and hardships of the journey. After another 5 days of steady travel, they were confronted by a local group at the banks of a river. Despite facing a barrage of stones while crossing the river, the survivors successfully regrouped with the captain and the first mate. There, the group encountered survivors of the São João, including a young man named Gaspar, who was eager to return to Christian lands. Despite the scarcity of food, most of the survivors, however, chose to remain in the area, waiting to be rescued. Gaspar, however, decided to join the crew. Recognizing the opportunity, he became their much-needed translator, believing his best chance of survival was to accompany the group of the São Bento. The group had now reached the area of KwaZulu-Natal. Briefly stopping to refill their stocks of shellfish, they decided not to linger. They needed to reach Lourenço Marques before he left Mozambique. As the group pressed north, they found themselves encountering more groups of people left behind by the São João. In what is now modern-day Richards Bay, they found 2 slaves from the previous group who had turned back after being unable to endure the hardships of the journey. The 2 men refused to join the survivors and warned them of the barrenness of the land they were entering. However, they promised to help the survivors navigate the bay, avoiding the streams and estuaries in the area, also securing a very affordable trade of goats, corn, and fish in the next village. The survivors filled their bags with as much as they could carry, but nothing could prepare them for what lay ahead. Manuel remarked that this was the turning point in their journey. This was no shallow warning, as over the next 5 days of travel, the group found no sign of human activity, traveling through barren land of shrubs and marshland. They were all tormented by thirst, sustaining themselves only on the moisture drawn out from elephant dung. During this time, conflict of authority became a pressing issue amongst the group. Although the captain was a veteran traveler and explorer, his age and injuries over the journey had drastically slowed down their progress. Tensions escalated as most of the crew members, led by the boatswain, began to ignore the captain's authority. These tensions culminated when they reached the St. Lucia River and debated the best way across. Some of the group sided with the captain, wanting to search upriver for a safe place to cross. However, the boatswain had lost complete faith in the captain and was more willing to go with the majority of common sailors on constructed rafts. Despite his objections, the captain and some survivors boarded a raft. However, disaster struck when a passenger became spooked and jumped overboard before swimming to shore. This upset the balance of the raft, and the remaining passengers, including the captain, were flung into the river, drowning everyone. The crew later recovered and buried the captain, and realizing the need for leadership, swore loyalty to the boatswain, Francisco Pérez, as their new captain. Despite a few more qualified candidates, most supported Francisco, who accepted the role and promised to lead faithfully. Over the course of the following weeks, the group's physical and mental conditions deteriorated rapidly as their supplies dwindled and the hostilities from the locals grew. Initially, the group struggled in their continued route across the marshland, leading to confusion and separation. While some men reached the coast by the guidance of some locals, others, including Captain Francisco Pérez, struggled to navigate without help. Encounters with the hostile natives further complicated their journey, as the locals attempted to rob them, leading to a confrontation where the group fired a gun to scare them off. As they moved along the harsh and barren terrain of the coastline, hunger and exhaustion took a heavy toll. Furthermore, exposure to the elements would tragically claim the lives of several slaves one particularly cold night. Building rafts became increasingly more difficult due to the lack of wood in the region, further slowing their progress. Furthermore, local villagers exploited the group's desperation, selling them food at outrageous prices. By now, the group had lost nearly all sense of order, scavenging for anything remotely edible, including bones and venomous snakes, as the hunger drove them to madness. The situation reached its worst when the group began to turn on each other, fighting over scraps of insects and small animals. Weak and broken, the group's only glimmer of hope came when they found a hill covered in wild onions. Though they feared they might be poisonous, their desperation left them no choice but to eat them, mercifully suffering no ill effects. This small reprieve marked the briefest break in their increasingly dire circumstances. It was during these days that Manuel de Mesquita Perestreo and his brother Antonio gradually began to lag behind the group due to Antonio's physical decline. It got to a point where the captain threatened to leave both of them in order to save the group. Unwavered by this, Manuel remained by his brother's side despite his protests. Under these heartbreaking circumstances, they exchanged words of love and sorrow. Antonio insisted that Manuel should leave, not waste his life caring for someone who had already accepted death, but Manuel was unwavering in his loyalty, As days turned to weeks, the survivors pressed on, becoming increasingly more desperate. They had to rely on trading what little they had left for food and water, often parting with precious items they had salvaged from the wreck. Trust became a rare luxury in these parts, with the local populations becoming increasingly unpredictable, with some willing to trade and others showing hostility towards the Portuguese, who were by now visibly malnourished, weak and struggling to maintain their pace. The group splintered further as they reached the edge of Zululand of modern-day KwaZulu-Natal. Some of the survivors, particularly the slaves who had endured the harshest conditions, chose to break away from the main group. These breakaway groups met varying fates. Some were taken in by the locals and survived, while others likely perished from starvation or hostility from neighboring groups. It was at this time that the group discussed the option of cannibalism. Although some of the group had already begun this practice in secret, the captain outright refused to agree to it, saying this would only worsen their reputation among the local tribes, and if they learned of this, they would surely be avoided or even pursued with greater hatred. Mercifully, just a few days later, on the 3rd of July, over 70 days after their ordeal began, the dwindling group of survivors finally reached the region near modern-day Maputo Bay, which they knew as the Lorenzo Marquis River. As the group was in dire straits, rather than risk any more confrontation, they surrendered themselves to the ruler of that region. Following a further 3 days of grueling travelling, the group, now totaling 56 Portuguese and only 6 slaves, finally arrived at the king's village on July 7th. The residents of the village were disgusted by their new arrivals, essentially walking skeletons, filthy and draped in rags. Despite the harrowing journey they had been through, their troubles were far from over. The ensuing food shortage was the greatest they had faced thus far. The village only hunted or scavenged for food as necessary, meaning they were unable to provide for the extra 60 mouths. Despite promises of food, the king often failed, leaving the crew in extreme hunger, forcing them to scavenge or buy secretly from the locals. It was at this point that several of them died from starvation, and yet another problem arose. As many of them were too weak to properly bury their dead, lions and other scavengers promptly discovered their bodies and quickly gained a taste for human flesh. It became a death sentence to be caught outside of their huts after dark, as several unsuspecting people were dragged off into the darkness, never to be seen again. In addition to the danger from the wildlife, the crew faced an infestation of lice that became unbearable, as many of them would multiply faster than they were killed. Some members even died from the bites, their backs and heads riddled with sores. To further add to their plight, Gaspar, their interpreter, recognized his value as the only one who spoke the king's language, and claimed he was the sole reason they were still alive. Motivated by greed, he exploited his comrades for personal gain. Gaspar, however, didn't survive long, as he disappeared one day while outside of the village. It is unknown whether he met his demise by a wild animal or at the hands of the crew. Finally, on the 3rd of November, 7 months after their ship was wrecked and when all thought they were doomed to never leave the African coast, a small Portuguese vessel appeared on the horizon. Many believed it was a dream, but upon realizing it was real, they could only attribute it to a divine act from God. Despite the hope of rescue fueling them to continue, 2 men died while traveling to the ship, too weak to continue their journey. The hardships they faced had decimated the group. Only 20 Portuguese and 3 slaves remained, of the over 300 people that had survived the initial wreck. The stark contrast in the percentage of survival between these 2 groups speaks volumes to the distribution of resources and labours endured on their journey. The story of the São Bento became part of a larger narrative of Portuguese shipwrecks along Africa's southern coast, joining the tragic tales of the São João and others. These shipwrecks left a legacy not only of disaster, but also exploration, resilience, and survival in one of the most unforgiving regions for 16th century sailors. For years after, the area where the São Bento wrecked became known as the Cape of Storms, a place of fear and fascination for those who navigated the treacherous waters around the Horn of Africa.